Hi everybody and welcome to Vega Virtual Talks. Today we have design thinking for strategic innovation with our very special guest Tony Bynum all the way from Chicago, and it's now 7 o'clock in the morning there in Chicago. Welcome to Vega Talks. Let's do a quick introduction of what the structure is going to be like. For today, we'll do a quick introduction to our speakers and our partners involved. Then we're going to have our two speakers present, which will take up about 45 minutes of the talk, and then a discussion session for about 15 minutes, and then our closing. Let me start by introducing Greg Day, who is the editor of KZN Invest. Greg and I went for coffee a while ago, and we came up with the idea of what if we were to start Vega Talk. So what he does is he would interpret these conversations and produce an article for KZN Invest. Please have a look out for what Greg produces from this discussion. And then you've got myself. Today I'm going to wear two hats today, so I'm quite excited about that. I usually am the facilitator for Vega Talks, but today I'm also going to be a presenter. Or a speaker, and we prefer being called conversation catalyst because that's the very idea that we produce conversations, and that the ideal is that the conversation extends from Vega Virtual Talks into other platforms and environments. So I am a thinking facilitator, and I'm passionate about facilitating creative, critical, and reflective thinking with an experience in design thinking facilitation, and I'm passionate about, and I've got expertise in the ability to make connections, providing ways of thinking for problem inquiry, idea exploration, and solution seeking. I have a history of about 2 decades being a Vega navigator, co-established the Durban campus in 2003, my apologies, and I've filled numerous roles here at Vega, including being a research supervisor, teaching creative development and corporate training, as well as curriculum development and academic management before I took over as the campus head. I'm also a fine artist, and I completed a master's in fine art, and you can follow me on Instagram with that handle. And then our very special guest is Tony. Tony is a Chicago-based design thinking specialist. So Tony, I'd like for you to unmute and just quickly say hello to everybody.
Hi everyone, it's great to be here. I'm looking forward to really speaking about this, and to which I know, based on your background, we'll have a great synergy.
Wonderful. I think our conversations are going to complement each other. I think the participants will see we're taking 2 directions for the discussion. So just by means of introducing Tony, Tony's got over 25 years experience and has worked with organizations to identify and create opportunities for growth and innovation that focus on delivering differentiation and sustainable advantage. Trained in user-centered innovation and design planning at IIT's Institute of Design in Chicago, Tony uses a structured, human-centered design approach that blends business strategy, social science, and design thinking. And by identifying obvious patterns and insights, Tony can untangle the complexities of human behavior and translating them into principles that drive strategic innovation, helping clients identify new opportunities for differentiated growth through the innovation of new products, services, and experiences. And you can see there that Tony is also quite involved in the different university spaces, contributing to the discourse and conversations around design thinking. I'm going to start with session 1, and before I commence with session 1, I would obviously want to say thank you to each and every participant that have joined today. We're very happy to see you in this virtual space. So yeah, I'm going to kick off session 1. So my section is going to work a little bit more on let's play with thinking. So let's kick start. There's 3 things I would like for us to consider, and you can see the design thinking. There are 2 key words in the idea of design thinking. And I'm going to say let's play a little bit with thinking. So I want to explore what it means to think, the ways and kinds of thinking, and then what brands or organizations need for thinking. Tony, I'm going to ask you if you can just quickly unmute your button.
Yep, I'm unmuted.
I mean mute. Apologies.
Oh, mute.
Thank you. All right, so what it means to think. Well, let's look at the definition. So to think is to direct one's mind towards someone or something. And I think that is the first key thing that I'd like to highlight, is how do we direct our mind? So what are the methodologies that we use in order to direct our mind towards something, someone or something? And how do you use one's mind actively to form connected ideas? And for me, the key word in this definition is how do you direct it and how do you actively do so in order to form connected ideas? And if you look at what we by a concept is when seemingly unrelated ideas connect to form a new and original idea. So the art of design thinking and the art of thinking at the end is to how do you facilitate for this to actually happen? The next thing that I'd like to point an idea in your direction is that I believe that thinking is an action. I think that you can use thinking more like a verb and to ask the question, how do you actually put your thinking into action? So to do that, maybe let's look at 3 questions we can ask ourselves. So in your environment, so every participant joining us today fulfill a different role. You obviously have a curiosity around design thinking and strategic innovation. So in your role within your organization, in whatever space you play, let's think a little bit about how can we actively, and how do we actively show our thinking. Thinking is good, but thinking is even better when you make it actively visible. If you create it in such a way that you can engage with your thinking. So if you make your thinking more visible and you show your thinking, how can we actively then collaborate with that thinking that you've made, that you've shown, and allow for engagement in that thinking? And when I say our thinking, therein sits a little bit of the formula of success, is that thinking can only be really productive, effective, if it becomes the collective or the team to collaboratively being able to engage in that thinking. And how can we tinker with and taste our thinking? And that for me is the essence of when I say, well, let's make thinking something that is an action. Those are some 3 key questions I think you want to ponder about and how you do it within your organization. Right, let's talk about problems. Often people get intimidated by the idea of, oh my word, there's a problem. It's got such a heavy weight to it. And people sometimes shy away from problem. I'd like to say that a problem is purely an invitation to a solution. It is just the beginning of asking you and suggesting to you that there must be solutions within it. So let's see it a little bit more positive. A lot of people talk about problem solving. And there in itself, people get intimidated by it and they don't always know how to go about doing it, or the problem becomes so overwhelming that we sometimes almost just ignore it. So if we shift the thinking and say, what if we were to think more about problem finding and solution seeking? And that in itself is almost a mind shift that needs to happen, and possibly even a cultural shift that may have to happen within organizations to encourage problem finding and encourage solution seeking. I believe strongly that we need more curiosity. I'm a mother of 2 beautiful children, and I'm always so intrigued when you look at how naturally children are highly curious beings. I strongly believe that we are born as curious beings, and we sometimes lose either the interest in being curious or the ability to being curious, or sometimes we were told not to be so curious. You know, curiosity did kill the cat, they say. After the cat, we just became more clever. So I believe that we need to encourage more curiosity. To think is also to question. So to think is to put something into action or through action, and then to think is also to question. To be able to ask questions is an art, it could be, or it's a case of, well, let's see where questions help us. Any form of inquiry or something to be inquisitive about is often driven by asking questions. And again, I can go back to the analogy of children. Freely ask the question why, and they do it because they want to understand and because they're curious to learn and make sense of the world around them. So the first step toward a great answer is to reframe the question. And that comes from the book Creative Confidence. It's worth a read. So to think is to question. Maybe we need more freedom to ask. We need more freedom to ask more questions, but also the freedom to ask some dumb questions, which sometimes is the very profound question to ask. And we need more freedom to play with and reframe questions, because if we create environments where you feel free to ask questions, it's encouraged to ask questions, and then to play and deconstruct those questions and reframe it, that's when shifting of perspectives can happen. That's when understanding can truly happen, to be curious, to learn, ultimately to discover. And then a key word here that I'd like to highlight is then to gain insight. And I know that Tony is going to latch onto insight as well in his discussion. I'm going to very briefly and for some people this is quite obvious, but I thought it's quite beneficial to think about what are the ways and kinds of thinking that are there. And I've identified 3 key kinds of thinking that I wanted to highlight for today. Let's start with creative thinking. I'm going to say that creative thinking is something that I am completely comfortable with. But that is me being an artist, being a creative or a perceived creative that feel comfortable with creative thinking. And maybe I'm wired that way. But for some people, creative thinking can be quite intimidating because often they don't see themselves as creative or they don't know how to do it. And you'll see that we're going to take the discussion through that these kinds of thinking actually translates into what design thinking can do for you. So creative thinking is where it's about generating ideas. It's the exploration and experimentation with possibilities and to chase inspiration. It's the divergent thinking. And then you get critical thinking. This is the more convergent thinking. It is the analysis, the judging, the critical questioning, the careful consideration of perspectives, and to avoid or question assumptions. And then you get reflective thinking. To reflect on something is to reflect on your own actions, to become actively aware of the process or context you're dealing with, to become more aware of the role that you play, your thoughts, your influence and impact, and ultimately to gain insight from the experience or actions, and then as a result, to improve on it. Now, if you look at these 3 kinds of thinking, the power of, and I want to actually say effective thinking, sits in diversity. The diversity of the kinds of thinking that you apply, the diversity of the thinkers that you invite into the space. Like I mentioned, I may be natural at creative thinking. I have the ability to apply critical thinking and reflective thinking, but in many cases, I've been trained to think that way. For some people, you need to actually consider how to invite people that are strong in certain kinds of thinking into the space so that you get a better holistic way of thinking to happen, and ultimately also cross-discipline collaboration. So for me, diversity sits in the diversity of kinds of thinking, the kinds of thinkers, but also the kinds of disciplines that you invite into your space for more healthy thinking to happen and effective thinking to happen. So effective thinking also requires facilitation. Often you need to ask yourself who within my team or my organization, or maybe someone from the outside, could help facilitate thinking for us, or is there a process, a structure that we can use that will ensure that this kinds of thinking can happen. So design thinking, and you'll see it playing with the word here to say, what if we can start thinking of it as design thinking? Design thinking incorporates all those kinds of thinking into a structure, into a format of how to utilize all these kinds of thinking and thinkers through a structured process. And Tony is going to elaborate more, obviously, on the design thinking aspect of it. So what do brands or organizations need for thinking to effectively happen? So to nurture and encourage thinking, I would say that you need an environment and a culture that supports that thinking. So let's play a little bit with my advice to everybody today, or some tips that I would like to share, or things that I'd like for you to consider, is what do we mean by environment and culture that supports thinking? So let's start with the first thing that I would provide today. So environment and culture that supports thinking, I would first suggest maybe shift the approach. I am a strong believer that we need less meetings and more think tanks. Can we shift our approach to when we have the most amazing resource that you have are your people? Now, if we spend the time together with people and you start considering people more as thinkers, people that can contribute phenomenal ideas and perspectives and thoughts, maybe reading how much time you spend on meeting versus actually producing thinking. The second thing I would suggest is allow for more curiosity. How do we do that? Allow a culture and environment where it is about asking more questions, maybe have less answers to begin with, and encourage rather that we start with playing more with questions and encourage questions to be part of the DNA of what you do. Invite more problems into the space, so see a problem rather now again as an invitation, and actively seek solutions. The third thing I'd like to recommend is be more open. Be more open to diverse thinking and thinkers. Be more open to the various sources for ideas. Ideas can come from such diverse spaces, places, and people. So maybe be more open of where ideas can come from. Be more open to cross-discipline collaboration. And I use cross-discipline for a specific reason because often it's when you combine. Remember that seemingly unrelated, if you combine more of that into the space, phenomenal ideas can come from it, and be more open for experimentation. And ask yourself, how do we create an environment and culture that will allow for these things to happen? And then the fourth and final I would like to propose is you need to plan for it. It's like saying that if you spend a certain amount of money in your budget, that actually suggests what you find to be important. So if you say that we would like to achieve these things, how do you create the time? And you can go back to the first suggestion, maybe have less meetings and have more think tanks. So create the time. Create the space, be that a physical space or a space where thinking can happen, and then to tinker and experiment. And obviously, you may have to allocate some budget to make these things happen. And it doesn't have to cost a lot of money in order to think effectively and creatively and innovatively. So what are the three takeouts from this on my part? Is respect and believe in the value of thinking. See the problems or challenges as an invitation to a solution, and create and invest in an environment and culture for thinking. And that's it from my side for today. Thank you, everybody. And this is where I'm going to hand over to Tony to contribute his part.
Thanks, Narita. That was great. And I do think I really feel strongly about the synergy we have in terms of how we're looking at design thinking and the role it plays. Because what I love about the idea of thinking is that it's obviously a very necessary part of coming up with a new solution. But really, what the two of us are doing is we're talking about design thinking as well as design doing. And I think it is about being active, just as you pointed out, in the problem solving, and not only looking for the problem, but then solving for that problem. So let me just kick off a little bit. Those of you who might have worked with me, who know me, know that there's a thought experiment that I like to do when I start out my classes or start out my presentations. And this thought experiment actually is one of the ways in which it's very easy to demonstrate what design thinking is and what it can actually do within an organization. So I just want you to think about this for a second. If you have a piece of paper and a pen to write on, design a vase. That's the only instruction I'm going to give you, is to just simply design a vase. You can design that vase in your mind if you like, but just come up with an idea of what a vase might look like. I'll give you a second to just think through that a little bit. Now, if we were in person, I would be walking around the room and just checking out what you guys would all be drawing and what would you be coming up with. And then what I would do is I would ask you to hold it up, and I would ask you to share that drawing with everybody that might be around you. And this is maybe what it might look like. These are some shots from a recent class. So the next instruction is to now think about a way to enjoy flowers in the home. And I'll give you a second to kind of noodle on that as well. It's a little bit more abstract for sure. And of course, if we were in person, what I would do is I would walk around the room, and then I would also ask you guys to share what you came up with. This is the point of this exercise, that if you look at the drawings on the left, they're vases, and they look like vases. You know, every time I've done this, the hundreds of times that I've done this, it always kind of turns out the same. There's usually a hole in the top, there's some sort of cylindrical object, it might have some shape or form to it, but it's a vase. But in the second question, when I asked you to design a way to enjoy flowers in the home, every single time I've done this, everybody comes up with something totally different, totally unique. Why is this important? When you think about business, when you think about the competitive environment that we're in, differentiation is key. If you're just designing vases, you're simply competing against your competitors. You're doing the same thing they are, maybe just a little bit different. However, when you reframe the problem, and Narita just pointed this out when she was talking about thinking, when you reframe that problem, what you're able to do is you're actually able to open up the possibility of what you're able to come up with. It's distinction, and it's a way of differentiating yourself from your competitors. The other thing I'll note is on the left-hand side, we've got products, and on the right-hand side, we've got experiences. When I asked you to design a way to enjoy flowers in the home, you in your mind, in some way, shape, or form, you thought about context. You thought about an individual. You thought, you defined what it might mean to enjoy flowers in the home. And all of that insight that you've generated when you're drawing your picture is exactly what this design thinking process is intended to do, but do in a very structured and repeatable way. So this is a way to and please try this. It's a fantastic thought experiment. It's a nice way to kind of kick things off and kind of open up the idea of what design thinking is and what it can do for an organization. So before we jump into design, I want to give a little background first. So I went to business school before I went to design school. So I actually started more on the business side, working with companies large and small around brand experience and new product development. And when I got to a point in my career where I started to realize that this design thing, and I didn't have the words for it at the time, was really interesting because it was a different way of solving business problems. And so that's when I went to design school. And I say this because the nature of this talk is really about how does design influence strategic innovation. Design can be used in a variety of different contexts. The point of view that I hold is design is a way to enact change within an organization. Said another way, design is a way to innovate. And what I want to share, what's on the screen right now, is really sort of an evolution or a maturity of design that might exist in the world today, and it might exist within many organizations. At the very lowest level, there's really no conscious idea of what design is. There's just not a vocabulary and an ethos around it. But at this next level up, design is viewed as a way to invoke style, to be on trend, if you will. It might be aesthetically driven. Taking that up a level in terms of its strategic importance, it's a way to make things work better. It's ergonomically sound. It's designed for specific users or use cases, context. I'm going to cross over now into thinking about design as a noun, because prior to that, it was really designing as a verb, designing something. And this is where we're going to hold the rest of our conversation, where we're thinking of design as a way to problem solve, as a way to frame problems, look at problems differently, and then use that insight to drive strategic change within an organization, to look out into the future, to backcast your way into a new future state in a more competitive and more differentiated way. This is something McKinsey put together that I think I really like, and what they've done is they've created a bit of a taxonomy around different problem-solving approaches. And when we think about problem solving, we're we often see this double diamond approach. Many of you are familiar with this. And it's really this, this activity around diverging and converging, diverging and converging. And if you think about that idea of looking for solutions, divergent thinking, and then using some sort of criteria or methodology to converge on your solutions, that's something that's happening regardless of the domain that you might be in. But what I want to highlight is really this hypothesis-led versus design thinking-led approach. Hypothesis-led problem solving is what you might characteristically see many of our management consultant partners do. It's a way in which in business school you're kind of taught to have a hypothesis, have an idea of what the problem or what the solution might be, and then go after that solution. Spend time really refining that solution. And you can see that at the beginning of the process, there's a small p. Contrast that with design thinking. You spend a lot more time in the problem space. And it's in that time in the problem space that you and the team that you're working with really start to gain a deeper understanding of the users, the context, and I would say even what the real problem is. And then you go after your solution. What I think is important to note here, when you're spending that time in that problem space, you're really challenging some of your own beliefs about what the problem is and even what the solution might be. It's very easy for us to work in a company that has a particular product or service and think that that is the solution for our end user or our client. But you might find that your product or service is a component of the solution. And it's in this problem space that we start to really define and redefine our approach and what the possibilities are for creating value for end users. There's a lot of talk about what's the value of design, and I'm not going to go deep into it in this conversation. I would encourage you to check out some of the work that's been done by DMI, the Design Management Institute, and McKinsey's done a lot of work on the value of design, and there's others that are out there. Said very briefly, there was some research that was done that demonstrated that organizations that were design-led, in other words, design lived at the very strategic levels of the business, had a 228% greater share value. And that's notable because if you look at that ladder, it's very similar to the one I showed you a few slides ago, that at the very highest level, design is actually being used as a way to make everyday decisions. I would say it's designed as a capability, not just simply a department or a deliverable, but it's actually the way in which the organization itself works. So it's baked into the DNA of the company. And it's at that level that the organizations are able to look beyond their product and actually look beyond bottom line and look at top line growth as a way to remain competitive and differentiate themselves in the market. So another piece by McKinsey that I'll show briefly, and I like this because when we think about those design-led companies, they've done a lot of work around, well, what's the DNA of that company? You know, I would be cautious about trying to copy a company. Of course, everybody wants to be Apple. And when you really dig into it, you probably really don't want to be Apple. You want to be who you are, but what you want to be is you want to be yourself authentically. You want to have your brand be authentic, but carry out some of these characteristics. Some of these top-performing design-led companies have analytical leadership. It's sort of baked into the way the organization is led. They're not afraid to think, as Narita would say, and think critically. There's a cross-functional aspect to talent. So many groups and many departments are working together all around being user-centric or human-centric in whatever the product or service might be. There's also a focus on user experience. And I'll talk about this a little bit, but we have to move away from product. And we need to really start thinking about what the experience is. If selling your product or selling something was the defining nature of what your business would be, Disney would be a great ticket sales company because they sell tickets. That's what they actually sell. But what you get is actually a memorable experience, something that has generational value. So it truly is not about the product, but rather it's about how that product creates unique value, unique experiential experiences for your customers or your clients. And then just this idea of continuous iteration. I would characterize this as learning. Narita had pointed out as a way of thinking. Thinking is how we learn. And some of these top-led companies where design is a strategic component are great learning organizations. They're literally built to learn. And I'll talk a little bit about learning as well, and the structure of how you feed insights and use insights as a way to drive innovation and change. I think, you know, I pointed out the idea of moving from products to experiences, but I think there's a new definition of value. And when we think about the products and services that we buy on a day-to-day basis, more and more as a society, we are looking for more me experiences than we are we experiences. And to characterize the difference, on the we experience side, things are kind of generic. Now, maybe there's a little bit of selection, but it's kind of made for one size fits all. And whatever that product or service might be is probably in a fairly competitive environment unless you own a great deal of market share. If you look at the other end of this tail, and this is really a variation of the long tail, we're looking at more me experiences. In other words, organizations and companies are designing experiences that are really that are more niche, that are looking at individual user and individual user needs, and they're creating these me experiences. We all want that. All of us want something that is sort of unique to us. And so this is the new, sort of a new definition of value, and I encourage organizations to think about, how do you play in the long tail? How do you take your product or service, whatever it might be, and how do you shape it for specific user types across your organization? And this is really a form of portfolio thinking. When you think about breaking up a portfolio of offerings, some of those offerings are going to be designed and aligned to different segments and different user behavioral types. So again, those of you who know me also know that one of the things that I talk a lot about is being structured and rigorous about how you carry out design. And more importantly, having a process that's articulated throughout the organization that others can follow. So it's a known. So I'm going to build a model here, step by step. I'm going to walk you through a structured innovation design process. So this process really starts with understanding that there are really two things that are happening when you're solving a strategic problem. You are doing something and you're working with information. So the doing something, the activity, is our x-axis, and the information that we use during those activities is our y-axis. So we're either knowing and understanding something, or we're making and doing something. And the kind of information we might be using could be abstract, or it could be factual and real. So what's the first thing we do? Well, the first thing we want to do is we want to know and understand that which is real. Well, that's called research. It's going out and understanding users in context of the use of your product or service. And this is really a tool and a way for us to develop empathy for our end users. So many times there's that hypothesis-based approach that I mentioned earlier, where we think about, oh, we already know what the problem is, or we already know what the solution might be, and we march ahead and we start to create what we think is a solution. But this first step is really grounding us in understanding who are we designing for and what are their real problems. So the next thing we want to do after we understand what is real, we then want to understand that which is abstract. And some may call this analysis. I like to use the term sense making. You're making sense of the facts and findings that came from your research phase. And when we're in analysis mode, we're really looking at identifying patterns. We're looking for relationships. This is where we develop insights. And the pause here that I'm going to take is that in that first box, that's where we get our facts and findings from. Those are empirical, evidence-based documentation of what people said, what you heard, what was observed. You take those facts and findings and we move them into the second phase, and what we're developing are proprietary insights. And I say proprietary because two companies can see the exact same facts and findings, but interpret them differently through the lens of their brand, through the lens of their business. And that's what makes it proprietary. I'll talk a little bit about some of the breakdowns that occur in not using proprietary insights in a bit. Well, the third thing we want to do now is we want to make something that's abstract. Well, some may call that synthesis, but really this is where we're starting to explore and develop solutions. Narita pointed this out in when she was talking about the creative side of business and creative thinking, and how creative thinking is one of the components that we build into problem solving. It's in this box, in this third box, that we do our ideation and our brainstorming. What I want to point out at this point is that a lot of times we start here. We start with generating ideas. Let's get everybody in a room and dream up our next innovation for our business. And you can see that by starting here, what you miss are those proprietary insights grounded in real facts and real findings that were observed during research. And the problem with that is, by starting there, is again, you're leaping to the solution and you're not creating a proprietary point of view on what that solution might be. What comes out of this step are concepts and solutions. And those concept solutions then bring us into this fourth box, which is where we're realizing things. This is where we do our prototyping. This is where we're taking what we abstractly understood and thought and created, and now we're trying to make it real. This is where we're going to make, build, and test. And this is very, very much learning through doing. This is, when you look at these four boxes, the interplay between creative thinking and critical thinking is pretty obvious. That we're very critical when we start out, and then we become more creative, and then we come back to critical. This is abstraction. During that vase exercise, I asked you to abstract the problem, as opposed to going from what you knew and designing a vase. When I reframed it, I forced you to go into boxes 2 and 3 at a much higher level, and then you came back down into box number 4, and that's what you actually drew. This is a learning process, and the key, if you're a people manager, is to keep your team in these modes of thought as you're moving through the innovation process. And I say that because by not having a structure like this, many organizations they can't articulate what their innovation process is, and it makes innovation a whimsical thing, something that's done sometimes that might have great results for the organization. But when you actually put together a structured process and a structured approach, it's a way to embed that into the organization at a cultural level. I've worked with companies that would use color coding across different departments, so that when a team or a group is in the synthesis mode, that color would be on their documents. When they were doing research, that color would be on that research. When they're doing their share out, the people that are sharing out know exactly where they were or where they are currently in the process. This process repeats. This is the iterative nature of design and design thinking. What we're doing is, once we have that prototype, first time around, it's usually a low fidelity prototype. It can be made of paper. It could be a paper prototype. What you want to do is you want to get that in front of folks in box 1, learn something about it in box 2, refine it in box 3, and you come down and you have your next prototype, your next, hopefully higher fidelity version of your prototype. So this is the iterative approach that we often talk about when we think about design. And each time around, the team that's doing this is learning something more and more about the users and more about the actual problem that they're ultimately trying to solve. The last thing I'm going to say about this before I move off of the structured approach is, this is about creating things that get you to the next thing. I sometimes use a kind of a strange but funny definition of design, and I'll say that design is the design of designs that help you design. And if you break that down, if you think about that a little bit slower, design is the design of something that helps you make the thing that you're trying to make. That's exactly what this process does. Each of the dark gray boxes represent things that are coming out of one phase that feed the next phase. It's this continuous build that makes this rigorous and structured, but it's also repeatable because you know what the expectation is going into each one of the phases. Let's talk a little bit about some of the barriers. I've done classes, I've done consulting with organizations, and what I found is that a lot of problems, a lot of barriers to innovation are very common, and they can be really summed up into a group of common themes. I'm not going to go through all of those themes because there's nuance to it, but I will talk about a few that really stand out. This first one is about thinking myopically. When you think about your business through the lens of just your product, just that thing that you do, you have hyper focus on that thing. But what you could be missing are broader opportunities. And a good example of this, a classic example, is if you think about the buggy whip businesses back in the turn of the century, you could be a buggy whip manufacturer and be very successful. But however, if you're asked what business are you in, at that time, during that time, you might say, well, we're in the buggy whip business. That would be the wrong answer because we don't need buggy whips anymore. If the answer had been we're in the transportation control business, let's say, some of those businesses may be around today or parts of them. So it's not about the product, it's about the outcome. It's about what you're ultimately trying to deliver. And this classic quote by Theodore Levitt, who actually wrote Marketing Myopia, is that your clients or your customers, they're not looking for the thing, they're looking for what that thing does. And our job as innovators, as designers, is to understand, well, what is that thing that they're looking to, what are they looking to have done? What's that outcome? And sometimes that can't be articulated. Therefore, we have to use qualitative anthropological methods to really understand our users in the context of the use. Just to simplify this, Nike doesn't really sell shoes, they sell running. Another idea of this is they don't need kerosene. What they really need is light. So this is an exercise that I like to do with companies and folks in a classroom-like setting, where we take a company and we look at what business are they really in, and when we broaden it, we can then identify richer, more systemic, more experience-based opportunities for growth. It's the top line growth that I mentioned earlier. Another barrier that I often see is we mistake invention for innovation. I sometimes get some pushback on this, but let me be really clear about what I mean. The Segway was a fantastic invention. It was a fantastic invention. It had all kinds of patents. It opened up the world of mobility to many people. You can't take anything away from it. Problem is, it never really had commercial success because it wasn't really solving a problem. Here in the United States, if you're a mall cop, it solved the problem for you. From a mass market standpoint, it really didn't solve a problem. And so what this gets into is just making something is not innovation in and of itself. Innovation, I'm going to offer, is something that solves real problems and actually has a financial return on the investment of making that thing. It opens up market share for you, provides that top line growth. If we take our definition of innovation and we constrain it to some very simple characteristics, it helps us identify what are hunches and guesses versus innovations. So I'll offer this as a definition of innovation. It's the creation of a new and viable business offering that solves a real problem. So when you break this down, it's different. It's actually providing some sort of viable business opportunity. Again, it pays for itself. It opens up market, but there's a financial aspect about it that allows it to remain sustainable. And it solves a real problem. I can't underscore that enough, because when we think about using design thinking as a way to drive strategic innovation, it's absolutely not about just coming up with whatever we think is cool or potentially needed, but it's about understanding the real problem behind our customers and users, and then backing into what that solution might be. A lot of times organizations will engage in what I'll call innovation theater. And this is sometimes known as chasing the shiny objects. It's about AI, or it's about data, deep data. Oh gosh, I'm blanking on the word right now, but data intelligence, whatever the technology might be at the time. What I'm showing you is Gartner's hype cycle, and this is something that I think is really important to kind of think about when we think about new technologies. It's really easy to chase that cool thing, but that's not enough. What we need to do is we really need to understand how does that cool thing actually play into creating value for our company and for our users. This is something that you might see with a lot of organizations where there's a period of time for many quarters or many years that all you hear about is one particular technology or trend that might be out there, and we're expecting folks to incorporate it. I would reverse that. I would say, let's look at whatever it is, but then let's ask ourselves, how might that play into creating value for the company and for our clients and customers. This is very much about being balanced. What's good for the company and what's good for your product or your client experience, and trying to find those solutions that fall along that diagonal. The other thing I see a lot is the confusion between creativity and innovation. I was talking to an engineer a few years back, and I was walking him through those 4 boxes that I shared earlier. Excuse me. And he stepped back and he said, "I get it, but that's not fun." And I said, well, innovation isn't necessarily fun. It's not about having fun. Sometimes it can be really frustrating. Think back to that vase exercise. When I reframe the problem, what I often see a lot of people do is ask, well, what do you mean by enjoy flowers in the home? And you see these sort of confused looks on their faces, and finally they get to coming up with whatever a solution is. Innovation is very much like that. You're stepping out into ambiguous space and complex space, and you're looking for answers. I had a mentor that used to say, it's like cutting ice cubes out of fog. Sometimes innovation can be really difficult and tough. No amount of Legos, Play-Doh, and Cush balls is going to help you innovate to competitive advantage. We can't confuse creativity with innovation, but you do need to be creative to innovate. And that's where that box 3 comes into play, where we do start to explore ideas and look for quantity of exploration over quantity at that particular time of the process. Well, another barrier that I see quite often is we often confuse findings and facts with insights. As I pointed out in the 2x2, we develop facts about what's happening in that first box through research. Those facts can be qualitative, they can be quantitative, but they're empirical facts. An insight is something that's born in looking into those facts and making connections, looking for relationships. And that's what an insight is. Often I see organizations relying on syndicated research firms and reports as their basis of insight. I can't tell you how many times I've had a client drop a package of slides, slide decks, and say, these are our insights. As you're looking through them, they're statistics. They're not insights. And so we can't confuse statistics with insights. Insights are the thing that actually launches us into something that's unique and proprietary. I want to be really clear. This type of secondary research is critically important, because what it does is it actually helps us shape and have an understanding and a model of what industry we're in and what some broad trends might be. Absolutely important input, but it's not what we base our innovation off of. It's one of the data points. So I'm going to end there. I want to thank Narita for the time to kind of speak to this. This is way too short, frankly, so I look forward to maybe doing this again. But I think we're going to address a few questions now, is that right?
Yes, we are, Tony. This is phenomenal. Thank you so much. And when we connected to prepare for the session, both of us were a little bit perplexed by the idea of presenting something or talk to something like design thinking in any form that is linear. And we, in a way, achieved that, which is the opposite of what design thinking is all about, is to do something in a linear fashion necessarily. Tony, this has been phenomenal. Thank you. There's so many good principles that you've conveyed that I think is very helpful for the participants. When we sent the invitation out, the people that RSVP'd could submit proposed questions they would like to ask. And then I took the questions and distilled it into 4 key questions that we're going to go into now as part of the discussion. And Tony, you are hero for the day. So I'm going to ask you to respond to these questions. So let's look at the first question we want to ask. What is the role, or what role can design thinking play in a startup business, and where would you start?
So this is a great question, and actually a very common question. It's asked in different ways. Design thinking can play a critical role in making sure that as a startup, you're solving real problems. If you think back to that 2x2, when you get to your solution stage in box 3, you're actually able to create breadcrumbs back to the very fact or the very observation, the real problem that your solution was born from. A lot of times, and not always, but a lot of times startups start with technology or a product, and they base it on whatever knowledge they might have about that technology or product. And then we look for users. But I think flipping that and making sure that whatever we have is grounded in true problem solving and true user insight helps us create a more compelling case and a compelling story for our product and the value that it shares. The other thing that I would say is, if we think about, so Gordon Moore wrote Crossing the Chasm, and if you think about a bell curve, when your early adopters, they get it already. They kind of understand your product. They might actually be fans of your brand, and they'll get you to that first stage. But it's crossing over into that early to late majority that can sometimes be difficult. And in order to cross over that chasm, we really need to understand what are the real problems that we're solving. What are the jobs to be done so that we can get mass market appeal, product market fit, as sometimes it's called. So I think design thinking is a way of really understanding what are the true unmet user needs that your product or your service is intended to address, and then you can start to create communication and story around how your product actually solves those problems. And this will get you out of that early adopter set and into that early and late majority.
Super, thank you, Tony. Next question we would like to ask, and how does the application of design thinking to finding new ideas and innovations still become profitable to a business?
Yeah, this is it's funny because there's a lot of work out there that is all kind of oriented at how do you quantify design. Well, one of the things that I would point, first of all, I would reference back to DMI, McKinsey, and Forrester, some of their work on valuing design and companies that are design-led. You'll actually see how their market caps increase because they are doing something that's unique and different and creating sort of unmatched, uncompetitive, uncontested value. But I would also offer, let's look at this from a top line, bottom line perspectives. There's 2 ways to become profitable. You can improve your bottom line, which is really about optimizing what you're doing today. And there's a lot of methods out there for doing that. Lean provides us with a multitude of tools to help us reduce waste and eliminate any of the inefficiencies that might be involved in making a product or a service or delivering it. Top line growth is the area that I would focus on when I think about design thinking, because Top line growth is about new markets, new products, new to the world, new to the company types of products and services. And that's what design thinking is probably best used for because of that abstraction. Again, go back to the vase exercise. When you reframe the problem, you're not just making something that you've always made before, but rather you're exploring and you're looking for opportunities that are new to the company and maybe even new to the world. So it's top line growth that I would aim our results for using design thinking at within an organization.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tony. So the next question we'd like to ask, we've got two more questions. How do you drive understanding of and the buying into design thinking across an enterprise or across departments within a brand or organization?
This, well, the first thing that comes to mind is that quote, remind me and I will remember, tell me, I might forget. Anyways, I'm butchering the quote, but the idea is if you involve people, they know and they understand. And there's really like 4 areas that I think you can involve the organization as a way to adopt design thinking as a way of solving strategic problems. Co-discovery, so think about that first box, getting folks out into the world and actually helping them with tools and methods to develop and create empathy for the end user. Co-analysis is a way in which you can bring stakeholders into the process and look at the facts and findings and analyze them with you. Therefore, those insights are authored by them. They've got some equity in it. And co-creation, moving into that third box where, again, you're bringing in stakeholders and you're helping them co-create those solutions, as opposed to coming back to your executives or senior leadership and saying, here's our idea, bring them into the making of that idea. And then there's make builds, where you're getting a variety of folks together and you're actually making a building. Each one of those boxes has a co-element to it. And this is a way of involving and adopting design thinking in an active way, not just simply doing presentations and showing frameworks and facts that result from your work, but rather bringing people into the work itself.
That's a brilliant advice. I eagerly wrote that down, Tony. That's a fantastic tip. You wanted to say something else?
I was going to say one last thing about this. I think organizations and my team and my company that we're working with, we're really getting good at storytelling and being able to tell a story about change and creating change narratives. I think it's another important piece to this.
Absolutely, and maybe co-storytelling. Now that we add the code to it. Yeah. The last question, and then we'll see if we can open for a question from the audience. Do you think that psychology or behavioral psychology play a role in design thinking?
Absolutely. What's really interesting about design thinking is it's an inclusive sport. Narita, when you're talking about the various ways of thinking, there are literally different modes, cognitive modes, as you're moving through that 2x2 in those 4 boxes. You're investigative, you're analytical, you're creative, and then you're actually making and building. And understanding how people do things, watching people make things, watching people build things. It's not what they build when you're doing participatory prototyping, but it's their logic for building things, and understanding the mental models that customers or users have around your product or service is critical to creating the thing that you're trying to that you're making in your innovation. And it's the psychology and understanding of how people think and what motivates them is what's behind a good structured insight. So there's absolutely a role. When I think about design thinking, it's really bringing social science, business, and a design approach together, and you're mashing it up. So it's psychology, sociology, anthropology, all of the humanities, I think, are really critical to developing unique, grounded, thoughtful points of view about change and about innovation. So there's absolutely a role. In fact, our research team at Northwestern Mutual is made up of PhD, master's level cognitive scientists and design researchers. So it absolutely has a strong grounding in being innovative.
Phenomenal. Sure, that's fantastic. Tony, this has been such a wonderful conversation. It's not every day that we have you available, and I'm sure there may be some curiosities and some questions within the participants might want to ask. I am going to suggest that we give it another 5 or 10 minutes. And if there are any peeps in the audience that would like to ask a question, you can raise your hand, and then you can go ahead and ask a question. So is there anybody that would like to ask a question? Let's see if there's an eager beaver. Okay, I see Sinead has got a hand up. Sinead, go ahead and you can ask your question.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Marys. Hi, Tony.
Hello.
Hi.
Tony, I just had more sort of like a practical question around any advice on tools that you use kind of quite frequently for design thinking sessions, particularly in a world where we're all working from home. Just want to know what tools and platforms you use to kind of facilitate any design thinking sessions.
Well, it's obviously a timely question because with COVID, things have radically changed the way we get together. I'll be very honest. I've always been one of the few people probably that have thought of design thinking as something that you can't do virtually, that you have to be in person and to do it. And I'm being proven wrong. So tools like Mural, and there's several of them that are out there, create these whiteboard spaces where teams can kind of come together and really talk through and discuss key issues around a particular product or service. My contention is that you don't just want to have a blank mural board, and I'm not plugging stretch. There's several of them out there, but you do want to go in with some very structured questions and some very structured activities that you're actually trying to elicit through that group. And if done right, using facilitation, you're actually in some ways you could be even more effective because you can bring more people into it. So there's the loss of being in person and being able to see someone eye to eye and really kind of ask those questions about what do you mean by that, or could you explain that a little better. You're able to maybe bring in more participants through some of these digital platforms. Other tools and methods would be frameworks, and there's several of them out there that can be used to kind of structure the information that you're gathering in these more remote, asynchronous ways. So I think it's one of those questions that is answered by every organization a little bit differently based on your culture. But if I were to tell you one or two things that you should absolutely do, is know what questions and what kinds of answers you want to get out of a session, and then create activities that facilitate those answers. No one wants to be a part of a workshop where they're not really sure why they're there or how their responses and feedback are going to be used. So be really structured about that and transparent about that as well.
Thank you, Tony. Let's allow one more question. Is there anybody else that would like to ask a question? Please raise your hand so I can see. Okay, Jeffrey, I see you raised your hand. Jeffrey, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, thanks. I just wanted to find out, in terms of a lot of this is very focused on sort of a customer, but I work in a business-to-business segment, a multinational one, in the marketing department. I'm curious, how I can sort of implement some of these in the sort of a bigger scale, but also smaller scale in that sense, but it's not, it's business-to-business. What would be the differences in this process?
So that's a great question. And that's often, and you're exactly right. I think you've seen more companies that are consumer facing really adapt design thinking faster, because it's a fantastic way to understand that end user. And in the B2B space, things do move a little bit slower. Our company is actually B2B, and we're B2B to C actually. One of the ways in which you can use this is to really use it as a way to facilitate an understanding of what's possible with that other B. So using this as a way to get your business partner on the same page, and you can actually go out and understand their customers with them, and then use that insight to improve whatever service or product you're providing them. But it goes back to what I said earlier: involve them, because if you don't, you're kind of guessing. And I think the other important point about this is it's really sometimes with design thinking in the B2B space, sometimes it's about how you engage your business partner, coming up with new and unique ways to engage them. If you're engaging them the same way that other competitors are engaging that same business partner, you're really not standing out and differentiating yourself, except for maybe your product or service that you're offering. But even finding innovation in the engagement is a really, I think, a really valuable way to apply design thinking. So I see two things. Using it as a methodology to co-create, analyze with them to understand what kinds of product services we could bring to the market together, and then also looking at it as a way to improve your engagements with them and your relationship long term.
Brilliant.
Good question.
Thank you, Tony. I'm going to make a suggestion, just because we are recording the session and I'm mindful of time. I'm going to conclude the session and then invite participants who would like to ask Tony a question after this to stay on, and then you can ask more questions to Tony if that's okay. So for that reason, I'm going to say thank you for everybody that have joined Vega Virtual Talks. It's been amazing to have you here, Tony, all the way from Chicago. Just shows you how small the world has become, that Chicago and South Africa can meet. And I can see that from the participants, we've got people from across South Africa that have joined in across different industries as well. So Tony, thank you so very much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it.